tumindi, nag-ibayo ang problema ng mga magsasaka sa buong bansa. Ang problema sa kawalan ng lupa, ang monopolyo sa lupa.
Historically, agrarian-related remedies extended by past regimes and administrators proved to be totally unable to fulfill the promise of alleviating the quality of life of the landless peasants. The land laws have invariably contained provisions that enabled powerful landowners to circumvent the law or even use the law to sustain and further strengthen their positions in power. Pre-Spanish era. Land was commonly owned by the community known as barangay, a small unit of government consisting of 30 to 100 families, administered by the chiefs. Land cultivation was done commonly by Cajun system, or the slash-and-burn method, wherein land was cleared by burning the bushes before planting the crops, or either land was plowed and harrowed before planting. Everyone in the barangay, regardless of status, had access on the land and mutually share resources and the fruit of their labor. They believed in and practiced the concept of stewardship, where relationship between man and nature is important. Food production was intended for family consumption only. Later, neighboring communities were engaged in a barter trade, exchanging their goods with others. Some even traded their agricultural products with luxury items of some foreign traders, like Chinese, Arabs, and Europeans. The Maractus Code seems to be the only recorded transaction of land sales during this time. This tells us about the selling of the Panay Island by the natives to the Tenbornan Datus in exchange of a golden salakot and a long gold necklace. Although the Code of Lawaran was one of the oldest written laws of the Muslim society, which contains provision on the lease of cultivated lands, there was no record how this lease arrangement was practiced. Spanish period, 1521 to 1898. One of the major initial policies of the governorship of Legazpi was to recognize all lands in the Philippines as part of public domain regardless of local customs. As such, the Crown was at liberty to parcel out huge tracts of Philippine lands as rewards to loyal civilian and military as rewards. In effect, communal ownership of land gradually and slowly took the backseat. Private ownership of land was introduced. With this arrangement, every municipal resident was given his choice of the land for cultivation, free from tax. Large tracts of uncultivated lands not circumscribed within a given municipality were granted by the Spanish monarch to deserving Spaniards. This kind of ownership became known as the encomienda. The encomienda system in the Spanish colonies began as a result of a royal order promulgated in December of 1503. By virtue of this royal order, encomiendas were granted to favor Spanish officials and clerics who were entrusted the responsibility to look after the spiritual and temporal developments of the natives in a colonized territory. In return for such a duty, the encomiendas enjoyed the right to have a share in the tribute paid by the natives. Legazpi himself had granted encomiendas to the friars, like the Agustinians in Cebu and Manila. Almost all the grant that Legazpi extended to the Spanish officials and friars were confined to what would eventually become the provinces of Cavite, Laguna, Batangas, and Bulacan. Much later, in place of the encomiendas, the Spanish authorities began to group together several barangays into administration units. They termed these units as pueblos or municipios, which were governed by gobernadorcillos. Together, the cabezas and gobernadorcillos made up of the landed class known as caciques, landed class. At the passing of time, the Filipino caciques intermarried with Spaniards. This gave such class as mestizo caste, which exists to this day. Through this enviable position, the cabezas de gobernadorcillos gained more and more stature or prestige with the Spanish civil and ecclesiastical authorities and the common people. In time, the caciques were given the prerogative of collecting taxes as well. This act vested in them great power. Certainly, this did not help to endear them to the ordinary people. Caciquism as an institution became deeply rooted in Philippine soil. This paved the way to many present-day agrarian problems and unrests. As the cacique system grew, it also became more oppressive. This brought about colonial uprisings during the 19th century, which tended to occur in the areas with much agricultural activity such as central Luzon. Agrarian-related problems were the only source of major conflicts during this time. Land was available in the entire archipelago. The major sources of conflict and rebellion were really the harsh Spanish impositions, such as tributo, polo, encomienda, and etc. During the 19th century, several developments occurred that solidified the land tenure system and aroused antagonism over its injustices and inequalities. Since the Spaniards did not levy a land tax or a head tax, and few records of land ownership were kept, the Spanish government issued two royal decrees, Decreto Realenga, 1880, and the Moral Law, 1894. These decrees order the caciques and natives to secure legal title for their lands or suffer forfeiture. The Filipino peasants, either ignorant of the processes of the law or of the Spanish written instructions, were just slow to respond. The landowners were quick to react. They did not only register their own land holdings, but also took advantage of the ignorance of the peasants by claiming peasant lands adjacent to their own holdings. It was estimated that 400,000 Filipino peasants were left without titles. No option was left for those dispossessed because documented titles to the land prevailed over verbal claims. Hence, most Filipino landed peasants became mere tenants in their own lands. The Royal Decree of 1894, Moral Law, deprived many Filipino peasants of their own lands through scheming and treacherous ways of both Spaniards and caciques. Other strategies of dispossessing peasants of their land holdings were 1. Outright purchase at a low price of real estates, realenga, by a Spaniard or a cacique from a badly in need peasants. 2. Mortgage system, Pacto de Retroventa, this is equivalent of today's mortgage system, Sangla. The mortgage system is equivalent of today's mortgage system, where a landowner who has loaned a peasant some money becomes this peasant landlord. This happened simply because the system required the land to be collateral. While the peasant had not paid back his loan, he paid the landlord rent for the use of his own land. Another source of land-related conflict by the late 19th century was the friar lance. Many farmers questioned the amount of land in grant given by the Spanish crown to the religious orders. Augustinians, Dominicans, Franciscans, and Recollect orders. Tenants paid tax termed as canon to the Philippine Revolutionary Government, 1898 to 1899. After the First Philippine Republic was established in 1899, the government of Emilio Aguinaldo declared its intention to confiscate large estates, the friar lance. American regime, 1898 to 1935. The Americans, considered by Filipino revolutionists as messiahs, liberators from Spanish colonial rule, finally unmasked their true colors. They themselves became the new colonizers by virtue of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898. The Treaty of Paris ended the Spanish-American War, and Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to America. Despite the apparent desire of the American government to improve the land tenure situation of the country, the following land laws and policies did not help in any way. 1. Treaty of Paris. 2. Land Registration Act of 1902. 3. Public Land Act of 1907. 4. Cadastral Act of 1907. 5. Friar Lands Act of 1907. Commonwealth era, 1935 to 1946. The government headed by Manuel Quezon passed and implemented the Rice Tenancy Act of 1933, Act No. 4054. Its purpose was to regulate the share tenancy contracts by establishing minimum standards. The act provided for better tenant-landlord relationship, a 50-50 sharing of the crop, regulation of interest to 10% per agricultural year, and safeguards against arbitrary dismissal by the landlord. The desire of Quezon to placate both landlords and tenants pleased neither. By early 1940s, thousands of tenants in central Luzon were ejected from their farmlands, and rural conflict was more acute than ever. Japanese occupation, 1941 to 1945. The Japanese occupation had a tremendous impact on the agrarian issue. From the ranks of the peasant and labor organization, and from the merger of the Communist Party of the Philippines and the Socialist Party emerged the Hukbalahap. A Hukbalahap was headed by a charismatic peasant leader, Luis Taruc. In addition to fighting the Japanese, the Huks also took upon the cause of the peasant against the landlords, who often collaborated with the Japanese to maintain their dominant position. Third Philippine Republic. 1. Rojas Administration, 1946 to 1948. In 1946, Rojas proclaimed the Rice Share Tenancy Act of 1933 effective throughout the country. RA number 34 of 1946, known as Tenant Act, provided for a 70-30 sharing arrangements and regulated share tenancy contracts. 2. Quirino Administration, 1948 to 1953. There were no agrarian reform laws passed during the Quirino administration. Instead, the agrarian reform policy of his predecessor was continued, but with little success. 3. Magsaysay Administration, 1953 to 1957. This administration signed into law 2 land-related bills. The Agricultural Tenancy Act of 1954 is RA number 1199, and Land Reform Act of 1955 is the RA number 1400. The Agricultural Tenancy Act of 1954 allowed tenants to shift from share tenancy to leasehold. In leasehold system, a tenant pays for a fixed amount to the landlord instead of the variable share. The act also prohibited the ejection of tenants, unless the Court of Agrarian Relations found just cause. 4. Garcia Administration, 1957 to 1961. This administration did not make any law or major pronouncements on agrarian reform. No new policies were made. 5. Macapagal Administration. He signed into law the Agricultural Land Reform Code of 1963, RA number 3844. This code provided for the purchase of private farmlands with the intention of distributing them in small lots to the landless tenants on easy terms of payment. In comparison with previous agrarian legislations, the law lowered the retention limit to 75 hectares, whether owned by individuals or corporations. It prohibited sharehold tenancy and established the leasehold system. It was viewed that a 75 retention limit was just too high for the growing population density. 6. Marcos Administration. Pre-martial law. First term, 1965 to 1969. The Agricultural Land Reform Code continued to be implemented by Marcos. Second term, 1969 to 1973. Congress amended the Agricultural Land Reform Code, P.144. Agrarian Reform Special Fund Act, RA number 6390, was passed. Our agrarian reform now is trying to complete its program. As said in Inquirer News, Budget Secretary Florencio Abad issued the statement as hundreds of farmers converged in Manila for a huge rally at Malacanang. Our President Noynoy Aquino seeks firm commitment that he will distribute the remaining 900,000 hectares of rime agricultural lands before the program ends in 2014. Let's take a look at Ms. Macy Gonzalez and Ms. Jean Duma's interview with Mr. Fernandez, one of the professor in UST, about his viewpoint and opinion about the issue on agrarian reforms.
Sir, what can you say about the agrarian reform of the Philippines?
It's been long overdue. because agrarian reform should have begun during the time of quarry. But actually, until now, they've had to re-extend the cart to really distribute the lands. They're almost done, except for Hacienda Luisita. So it's something that's needed.
Why is there a need for agrarian reform?
You have to remember that we're an agricultural country, meaning most of our citizens are actually farmers, or at least those are engaged in aquatic agriculture like fishery. So, if you would give them the land, then it means that you are enabling them to get the land, to cultivate it, to earn money. When all of the farmers have money, their purchasing power increases, meaning they can buy services, they can buy goods. That's why the economy will grow. Instead of centralizing everything on Manila, and we don't have farmers here. Manila is okay, but the rest are not. So that's why you have to empower them, so that they will buy the services of Manila. Okay? So that everybody will have enough money to purchase goods.
In your own opinion, for whose administration does the agrarian reform in the Philippines was more implemented properly?
Well, I cannot say that I have enough knowledge about that because, of course, I was only a little kid when they began that. I was not even born. But I just hope that Noynoy will be able to finish. Because the only last thing is Hacienda Luisita. And that's, so it was began during his mom. I think hopefully.
This presentation was preferred by Macy Gonzalez, Salen Bermontes, Honey May Giles, Jean Duma, Joggy Hermoso, Jessa Fernandez, Merson Gamabe, Randy Delhaven, and Roman Floriza.
Buong kapuluan, kapit